Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to look at the use of software auto forms by adding defaults to the controls available. In our last project video, we had added the tick box control to our configurable auto forms application. When this application runs, you are presented with a Select a Form dialog. What appears on that dialog is a list of the configuration files. Each configuration file is a CSV file and contains a list of objects which will dynamically appear on your dialog. This gives the ability to create an application with a simple dialog with controls on the form. This can be filled in by the user, and clicking the OK button will append the data to the end of a CSV file. This CSV file will contain all the data keyed so far. However, one thing we haven't added to the system yet is the ability to set a default on one of these fields. Say, for example, you're doing a large recruitment, and the bulk of the staff being recruited are all coming in with the same job title and into the same part of the organisation. How can we set the form up so that some of these fields will be pre-populated? So in order to do this, we're going to add an extra column to our config files. We're going to add a defaults column. So let's have a look at the config file. So we have created a new testdemo3 CSV file. This will be our third config file. If we have a look at that config file, we will see there is now a new defaults column. So into this defaults column, we set a value for the drop-down list of finance. Finance is one of the departments that appears on that list. And our object is to ensure when the form is loaded, the finance department is pre-selected. On our list box, we've put in a job skill of admin assistant. And in the tick box, which is the one that records whether the staff are full or part-time, we put a value of 1 to indicate we want this tick box pre-ticked for the user. So what do we need to change in our application to support this additional functionality? Let's have a look at the code. As you will remember from the last video, there are a series of functions that may need to be amended if we're adding new functionality. And that is this list here. So as we have added a new column to the config file, we need to add to our enumeration. This is our enumeration at the moment, which has a list of each of the fields and their position in the config file. We're going to add a new value to that. We have now added the default value column. Since we're going to be using the defaults column, we want to know when we need to populate the form on screen with these default values. We obviously don't want to overwrite values that the user has already entered in a previous form. So we're going to make use of a function we have created earlier but not yet used within this application, and that is the reset form. So first we need to look at the run control process function. This is our event handler for our configurable dialog. Within this function is the logic to actually save a form to the CSV file. And there's already logic built in here to work out, are we on the last form? Do we need to increment the global form number and present to the user a blank form? So in here, we're going to make the call to our reset form function. This function takes no parameters. So let's go to the reset form function, which exists, and see what changes we need to make. At the beginning of the reset form function are a number of declarations of local variables. We're going to have to create a couple of new local variables to be able to handle the defaults column and the value within that column. We're going to call these variables default as a string and defaults column as a number. This last variable will be the column number of the default column. So the next part of the logic is where we pick up these column numbers. So we're going to actually add in a line of code to pull back the default column number. This using our parseFind function, just as we've done with the other two lines, object and ID. Next, within the for next loop, we need to pick up the actual value held in that defaults column. In most of these objects, there is no default. The default will be an empty length string. So we're pulling it back from the config array. The next part of the logic is where we wipe the text in each of the controls, either by unselecting a combo box or setting the text to an empty length string. For the text control, we merely have to use the default value in the population of the string, as we've currently got an empty length string. So since the default value will either be an empty length string of a value, this can be quite easily populated. For the drop-down list, we can test to see if the default is an empty length string, in which case we want to unselect the control, as we have done already. Or if the default value is not an empty length string, we will attempt to select from the combo box the value that's been passed in as the default. Like so. So we're going to use exactly the same logic for the list box, except this case we'll be using the select list box function, and the same for the date and for the tick box. So with that logic in place, resetting the form should now populate the values on the controls either with an empty length string, unselected, or the default value. So that handles the reset form function. Now we need to look at the form which fills a form with a record. As before, we're going to add another set of local variables. This to handle the defaults column number, plus the value within that default column, and the final variable is to handle a data line that has no delimiters. This will mean when we get back a value from the form that has nothing in it. Having picked this up, we can actually test it. So where we've reached the end of the forms, then the str data contains an empty length string. So we can mark the str data no delimiters variable with the value in str data. Where there's some value coming in, we'll need to pick up the value that's in str data and attempt to remove any commas from it. This gives us a mechanism for working out whether the entire data line is actually empty or if it's populated. If it's populated at all, there'll be something there other than commas. As we did in the previous function, we need to pick up the column number of the defaults column, as we have done for the field name and the object columns. And within our for next loop, we need to handle the default value to pick up the default value should it exist in our config file, just as we did in the previous function. Then we get to the bit of logic where the control has been identified and we need to populate it with some data. We're currently picking up the value from the value within the data string returning from the global array. Next, we have to test our data no delimiters variable to see if it's an empty length string. If it is an empty length string, this is obviously a new unpopulated form, and we can pick up the default should it exist from the default variable. And since str value is populated, the logic that follows that will take that value in quite normally. And in theory, that should be all the changes we need to make to the code. Now we need to test it to see whether it's functioning properly. So our command line is currently looking at the testdemo3 CSV file, which is the one we have populated. So if we run the code now, it will take us to form 9, which is currently unpopulated. And as we can see, it has selected finance as the department and admin assistant as the skill, and it is ticked for full-time staff. So for the very last form, which is unpopulated, it has correctly populated all our defaults. So we can step back in the forms and have a look at the ones that have already been populated. And there is a previous one where the full-time staff is not ticked. And look at form number 7, and it's a different department and a different skill. If we look at the View All Forms, we can see everything is populated correctly, so let's try populating form number 9. If we go to the last form, we can see the defaults have been set. And if we click the OK button, it's now moved us on to form number 10, and it has pre-populated finance, admin assistant, and the full-time staff tick box is ticked. If we go back to our View All Forms, we can see the one we did previously has been keyed in correctly. It's marked it as finance, admin assistant, and full-time has been ticked. So what we've achieved today is the ability to set defaults. So should you have a mass input of new staff, you can set the defaults for the majority of the ones. So let's go in and see if we can add a new form and change one of the defaults. At the moment, we have full-time staff, which we will untick, and we will pick DB admin instead, but we will leave finance pre-selected. And if we hit OK, it moves on to the next form, which has pre-selected as finance and admin assistant. But if we look at all the forms, we'll see that Jane Jones is down as, although finance, the skill is DB admin, and full-time is unticked. If we exit out of the application and have a look at the output CSV file in our data folder, there is our user data file, and there is our entry. So what we have achieved today is we have configured the application to support defaults, allowing you to set defaults for any of the fields. This will give you additional flexibility when it's needed. Hopefully you'll find this code useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.